Hi, everyone. I'm Missoula County Commissioner Dave Strohmaier and am joining you today to put in a plug for a super exciting event that's coming up, and that is the annual Historical Museum at Fort Missoula's book sale. This has been going on for over a decade now and is a great way to help the museum raise funds for its programming and operations. This year, obviously, we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and as a result, the sale will be virtual, but the sale will go on. I am here today, among other things, to also share with you a reading from one of my favorite authors and books. This book, Owning It All, by Bill Kittredge, is yet to be seen whether you will be able to find a copy of this at the annual Historical Museum at Fort Missoula's book sale. Perhaps you will. Perhaps there will be another volume of William Kittredge's work that you could pick up there. But I just want to give you a taste of Bill's writing, this particular book, which for me, it's an important piece of writing and literature because it delves into not only Bill Kittredge's experience growing up and living in southeastern Oregon, but also more broadly to the idea of what it means to control, to exert dominion over the landscape of the West that we call home, and how we might re-envision our future with the land and this landscape going forward. So with that, I'm going to read a little piece of little excerpt from this book, and then I'll share a few words about the book sale that will be coming up. So an excerpt from William Kittredge's book, Owning It All. Down by the slaughterhouse, my grandfather used to keep a chicken wire cage for trapping magpies. The cage was as high as a man's head and mounted on a sled so it could be towed off and cleaned. It worked on the same principle as a lobster trap. Those iridescent black and white birds could get in and feed on the intestines of butchered cows. We never butchered a fat heifer or steer for our own consumption, only aged dry cows culled for the breeding herd. But they, the magpies, couldn't get out. Trapped under the noontime sun, the magpies would flutter around in futile exploration for a while and then would give in to a great sullen presentiment of their fate, just hopping around, picking at leftovers and waiting. My grandfather was Scots-English and a very old man by then, but his blue eyes never turned watery and lost. He was one of those cowmen we don't see so often anymore, heedless of most everything outside his playground, which was livestock and seasons and property, and as the seasons turned, more livestock and more property, a game which could be called accumulation. All the notes were paid off, and you would have thought my grandfather would have been secure and released to ease back in wisdom. But no such luck. It seemed he had to keep proving his ownership. This took various forms like endless litigation, which I have heard described as the sport of kings, but the manifestation I recall most vividly was that killing of magpies. In the summer, the ranch hands would butcher in the afternoon cool of an evening a couple times a week. About once a week, when a number of magpies had gathered in the trap, maybe 10 or 15, my grandfather would get out his lifetime 12-gauge shotgun and have someone drive him down to the slaughterhouse in his dusty, ancient gray Cadillac so he could look over his catch and get down to the business at hand. Once there, the ritual was slow and dignified, and always inevitable as one shoe after another. The old man would sit there for a while in his Cadillac, and gaze at the magpies with his merciless blue eyes, and the birds would stare back with their hard black eyes. The summer dust would settle around the Cadillac, and the silent confrontation would continue. It would last several minutes. Then my grandfather would sigh and swing open the door on his side of the Cadillac and climb out, dragging his shotgun behind him, the pockets of his gray gabardine suit coat like a frayed uniform bulging with shells. The stock of the shotgun had been broken sometime deep in the past, and it was wrapped with fine brass wire, which shone golden in the sunlight, while the old man thumbed shells into the magazine. All this without saying a word. In the ear of my mind, I try to imagine the radio playing softly in the Cadillac, something like Roomful of Roses or Candy Kisses, but there was no radio. There was just the ongoing hum of insects and the clacking of the mechanism as the old man pumped a shell into the firing chamber. He would lift the shotgun, and from no more than 12 feet, sighting down the barrel where the bluing was mostly worn off, through the chicken wire into the eyes of those trapped magpies, he would kill them one by one, taking his time, maybe so as to prove that this was no accident. He would fire, and there would be a minor explosion of blood and feathers, the huge booming of the shotgun echoing through the flattening light of early afternoon, off the sage-covered hills and down across the hay meadows and the sloughs lined with dagger-leafed willow, frightening great flights of blackbirds from the fence lines nearby to rise in flocks and wheel and be gone. Bastards, my grandfather would mutter, and then he would take his time about killing another. And finally he would be finished, and turn without looking back, and climb into his side of the Cadillac, where the door still stood open. Whoever it was whose turn it was that day would drive him back up the willow-lined lane, through the meadows to the ranch house beneath the Lombardy poplar, to the cool shaded living room with its faded linoleum, where the old man would finish out his day playing pinochle with my grandmother and anyone else he could gather, sometimes taking a break to retune a favorite program on the Zenith transoceanic radio. No one in our family, so far as I ever heard, knew any reason why the old man had come to hate magpies with such specific intensity in his old age. The blackbirds were endlessly worse, the way they would mass together in flocks of literally thousands to strip and thrash in his oat and barley fields, and then feed all fall in the bins of grain stockpiled to fatten his cattle. Where is the difference? I asked him once about the magpies. Because they're mine, he said. I never did know exactly what he was talking about, the remnants of entrails left over from the butchering of culled stalker cows, or the magpies. But it became clear he was asserting his absolute lordship over both, and over me, too, so long as I was living on his property. For all his life and most of mine, the notion of property as absolute seemed like a law, even when it never was. Most of us who grew up owning land in the West believed that any impairment of our right to absolute control of that property was a taking, forbidden by the so-called taking clause of the Constitution. We believed regulation of our property rights could never legally reduce the value of our property. After all, what was the point of ownership if it was not profitable? Any infringement on the control of private property was a communist perversion. But all over the West, as in all of America, the old folk way of property as an absolute right is dying. Our mythology doesn't work anymore. We find ourselves weathering a rough winter of discontent. snared in the uncertainties of a transitional time and urgently yearning to inhabit a story that might bring sensible order to our lives, even as we know such a story can only evolve through an almost literally infinite series of recognitions of what individually we hold sacred. The liberties of our people came seeking are more and more constrained. And here in the West, as everywhere, we hate it. Simple as that. And we have to live with it. There is no more running away to territory. This is it for most of us. We have no choice but to live in community. If we're lucky, we may discover a story that teaches us to abhor our old romance with conquest and possession. My grandfather died in 1958, toppling out of his chair at the pinochle table soon after I came back to Warner, but his vision dominated our lives until we sold the ranch in 1967. An ideal of absolute ownership that defines family as property is the perfect device for driving people away from one another. There was a rule in our family: what's good for the property is good for you. Every time there was more money, we bought land, my grandmother proclaimed after learning my grandfather had been elected to the Cowboy Hall of Fame. I don't know if she spoke with pride or bitterness, but I do know that having learned to understand love as property, we were all absolutely divided at the end. Relieved to escape amid a litany of divorce and settlements, our family broken in the gateway. I cannot grieve for my grandfather. It is hard to imagine these days that any old man, any man, could ever again think he owns the birds. So that was an excerpt from a chapter called Owning It All in the book Owning It All by Bill Kittredge. Highly recommend it. So again, I would encourage you in the month of December to avail yourself of the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula's virtual book sale in the year 2020. An odd year for all of us, but a year in which we are being creative and figuring out how to carry on business even in the midst of these tumultuous and uncertain times. So if you'd like to find out more about the book sale, go to the museum's website at fortmissoula.org. You can find out more there. You can also send an email message to Jesse Rogers at jrogers, that is JROGERS, at missoulacounty.us. You can message the museum on Facebook. And ultimately, history matters. So investing in your very own historical museum at Fort Missoula here in Missoula County is an investment in your future and your heritage here in Missoula County. Thank you all. Have a great day. Be safe and be well.